I'm Dan Palazzolo. I'm a professor of political science and co-director of the Gary L. McDowell Institute, along with my colleague Terry Price, professor of leadership studies. And my voice is compromised, so hang with me. We're really pleased to welcome you to the first lecture of the academic year. As you all, some of you probably know, the McDowell Institute is dedicated to the values of its namesake, Gary L. McDowell: free inquiry, thoughtful deliberation, and rigorous discussion of classical texts and political economy. The Institute welcomes members of the University of Richmond, all members of the University of Richmond community, and a wide range of political perspectives. The programs of the McDowell Institute would not be possible without the support of administrative leaders, members of our Board of Advisors, McDowell Institute staff, and our contributors. So we'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank Dr. Sandra Peart, who's Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and members of our advisory board, several of whom are here tonight, at least two are here tonight, Jeff Sedgwick and, of course, Brendan McDowell, for their support of the McDowell Institute. We also appreciate the day-to-day operational support, innovation, and creativity of our program coordinator, Heidi Thompson, who once again has done an outstanding job of coordinating all aspects of the event, including putting Lincoln's second inaugural address on parchment paper. So if you didn't get a copy on this on the way in, be sure to get a copy on the way out. Finally, we'd like to thank our friends and supporters of the Institute, the Pauley Family Foundation, the Endeavor Legacy Foundation, and anonymous contributors for their generous gifts that make our programs possible. So I want to make two notes. Oh, come right in, come right in. You're just a little bit late, no worries. But as long as you have the parchment paper, that's your ticket. So there are a couple quick notes before we begin. There'll be some time, should be some time for questions after our speakers' prepared remarks. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand, and someone with a mic will try to come and give you the opportunity to ask that question. After the Q&A, we'll have a reception right up here in the Mulchert Commons, and an opportunity for guests to purchase a signed copy of our speaker's latest book. So now it's my privilege to introduce that speaker. Dr. Diana Schaub is Professor Emerita of Political Science at Loyola University, Maryland, and a non-resident senior fellow scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. She was the Garwood Teaching Fellow at Princeton University and visiting professor of political theory at Harvard University. From 2004 to 2009, she served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. Dr. Schaub is a recipient of the Richard M. Weaver Prize for Scholarly Letters and is the author of Erotic Liberalism, Women in Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters, along with numerous books, book chapters, and scholarly articles in the field of political philosophy and American political thought. She's also co-editor with Amy and Leon Cass of What So Proudly We Hail: The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song, a book, by the way, that is highly recommended by our own Dr. Kevin Cherry, Associate Professor of Political Science, who has used the text in several courses. Dr. Schaub is a member of the Board of Directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and sits on the Publication Committee of National Affairs. Her latest book on Lincoln's rhetoric and statesmanship, His Greatest Speeches: How Lincoln Moved the Nation, which is right here, will be available for purchase after the lecture. Dr. Schaub met earlier today with some students for a lively discussion of Frederick Douglass's speech, Oration in the Memory of Abraham Lincoln. And this evening, we are delighted that she will be speaking with us on the topic, the second inaugural, Lincoln's Rhetoric of Reconciliation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schaub.
Thank you for that introduction. And I am delighted to be here under the sponsorship of the McDowell Institute. I met Gary McDowell all the way back in 1981 when I had just graduated from Kenyon College. And Gary, I think, was a newly minted PhD and faculty member at Dickinson College. Gary, along with Gene Hickok, ran a summer institute on political philosophy at Kenyon that was fondly known as Philosophy Camp. I could see he was a wonderful teacher, but I certainly didn't realize at the time the distinguished career that he had ahead of him. I plan to speak tonight about Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, and I actually trust that many of you are familiar with the speech, maybe even having committed it or parts of it to memory. But still, I've taken the liberty of putting the text of the second inaugural into your hands so that we can start from the same page together, and it is just one page, a little bit more than 700 words. If you look first at the fourth and final paragraph, you'll find the best-known passage of the address, Lincoln's call for citizens to act with malice toward none, with charity for all. Yet before charity could be possible, Lincoln believed it was necessary for Americans to understand what had happened to the nation. Reconciliation of the right kind required truth-telling and an inquiry into the cause and purpose of the war. Thus, in the second inaugural, Lincoln revisited the conflict, both its outbreak in 1861 and its ultimate origin in 1619. He offered an interpretation of the Civil War that, if accepted by all, would unite whites, North and South, in humility before God's judgment upon American slavery, and that would, in consequence, create the civic space in which blacks could unite with whites under the same flag as neighborly citizens of a common country. Despite its large aims, Lincoln's second inaugural is among the shortest of inaugural addresses. Only Washington's second inaugural and Roosevelt's fourth inaugural are shorter. Although Lincoln begins, as was usual, with a reference to taking the oath of office, after that, he does none of the usual things. I mean, you can probably think, what are the things that you need to do in a second inaugural? What would be the standard thing to do in a second inaugural? Well, you express gratitude to the people for your reelection. You offer a review of the policy successes of your first term, and then you sketch out your plans for the second term. Lincoln does none of those things. Now, of course, there was nothing usual about a national election in time of civil war. Remember, in March 1865, the war is still going on. There are 5 more weeks of war ahead, and that actually meant 25,000 more casualties during those 5 weeks. Only 25 of the 36 states participated in that election of 1864, since the other 11 states still considered themselves to be a separate nation. Another feature that characterizes inaugural addresses, whether it's a first or a second inaugural, is that they try to achieve a reunification of the nation after the intense partisanship of an electoral contest. So think of Thomas Jefferson, right? That first highly contentious election that we had, the election of 1800. In his first inaugural, he promises to be president of all the people by announcing, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." For Lincoln, however, the task of reunification was more difficult because it extended well beyond the parties to the election. It had to include the parties to the war. One of the first rhetorical techniques that Lincoln adopts is to submerge himself. And again, this is rare in inaugural addresses. Presidents usually say "I" a lot in these addresses, and they do that even if they aren't clinical narcissists. Lincoln, however, makes only one reference to himself, and that is in a little parenthetical aside toward the end of the first paragraph. Given that the occasion was Lincoln's own inauguration, his studied avoidance of self-reference is difficult to pull off. Indeed, the attempt to sink himself from view leads him into a rare grammatical error. Lincoln was a notoriously bad speller. I mean, he always spelled the word inaugural wrong, for instance. But he was an excellent grammarian, for the reason I think that grammar is closely linked to logic. So take a look at the last sentence of the first paragraph. Speaking of the progress of Union arms, Lincoln says, "With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured." You know the technical word for that error?
Passive voice?
No. Lincoln, I mean, it may be in passive voice. Lincoln uses the passive voice all the time. And the war came, maybe the most famous sentence ever to use the passive voice. There's no problem with using the passive voice if you're using it for a good reason. This is called a dangling modifier. Right? What is the subject of the sentence? The subject of the sentence is no prediction. No prediction is not an entity capable of having high hopes. So fixing the sentence would require Lincoln to center himself in the sentence. He could have said something like, with high hope for the future, I venture no prediction in regard to it. So despite being center stage, Lincoln refuses the limelight. Okay? He's submerging or sinking himself. Now, we might ask, what replaces I as the operative actor? Well, politicians often substitute we, right? They focus on the collective. Now, Lincoln had done that brilliantly in the Gettysburg Address, where he also caused himself to disappear. There's no use of the word I in the Gettysburg Address. 272 words, and there are 10 instances of we. It is the most frequently used word in the Gettysburg Address, right? We cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. Right? We are gathered here for this purpose. We. Lincoln makes some use of we in the second inaugural, but he relies much more on the indefinite pronoun all. All is far and away the most frequently used word in the second inaugural. It appears 10 times. All always refers to some whole quantity, whether of persons or things. The second inaugural is a speech about the whole, about how to put the whole population of a badly fractured country together. In the second inaugural, Lincoln is setting about to discover or to construct an all out of discordant parts, including not only the parties to the war, but also the newly freed 1/8 of the whole population, to which he refers at the start of the third paragraph. In other words, the 4 million former slaves whose status will have to be clarified. Right? Will they be fellow citizens? Will they be fellow voters? Will they be neighbors, friends, spouses? Lincoln must acknowledge the existence of these heterogeneous parts without deepening the divisions between those parts. Now, I think that every word, sentence, and paragraph of this speech is worthy of close attention, but we don't actually have enough time today. I think we need probably about 3 hours to begin to do this speech justice. So what I'm going to do is give a super quick overview of the first half of the speech, and then I'm going to spend most of the time on the really crucial third paragraph. All right, so the first paragraph. It's mostly about why Lincoln is going to deliver such a brief address. Right? Why is this inaugural address going to be so short? Why is extensive speech less called for now than at the time of his first inaugural? So the speech actually opens by toggling back and forth between 1865 and 1861, between now and then. Starting from the present, Lincoln will act as an archaeologist of the war, uncovering first the surface layers of the war before he uncovers the deeper deposits, its underlying cause, its hidden but central purpose. Now, since I've already indicated that all is the most used and the most important word in the speech, let's first take notice of how Lincoln uses the word in the opening paragraph. Okay? Lincoln speaks of the progress of our arms as reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. In the same sentence, he indicates that all else chiefly depends on this military success of the Union arms. So, who's included within the all in the first paragraph? I know it's a lecture, but you can answer if you want. I can call on a student, yes? I met some of these students earlier. Jack.
I'd say saying it to everyone in support of the union.
Yes. In other words, but that means only Unionists, right? Only Unionists and not the rebels could feel cheered by the current military situation, right? The war's not over, but it's pretty clear at this point the Union is going to be victorious, right? So the progress of our arms, right? Reasonably satisfactory, that's only reasonably satisfactory if you're a unionist. So as he first uses the word, all is limited to the supporters of the Union. Yet, instead of celebrating or taking credit, right, for the incipient Union victory, Lincoln reminds his immediate audience that victory in war is not for its own sake. It is for the sake of what he cryptically calls all else. All else depends on the victory of Union arms. Now, by speech's end, I think we'll have a better sense of what is entailed in that all else. All right, second paragraph. Whisks us back from March 4, 1865 to March 4, 1861, the day of Lincoln's first inaugural. So the second paragraph, I think, is an explanation of the outbreak of the war. And a few points, I'm going to sort of summarize what I think are the main points that emerge from this second paragraph. First, nobody wanted war. Okay? There were no belligerents. There were no warmongers. Okay? Nobody wanted the war. Second, the conflict was over the Union, whether it would be destroyed or saved. Third, although nobody wanted war, the war was nonetheless the consequence of human choices. One party was prepared to make war, and the other party was prepared to accept war. In other words, each had something in view that it regarded as more important than war, something important enough to justify war. Fourth, war was a consequence. That's the point of that sentence in the passive voice. And the war came. Right? War was a consequence. War was a logical result. It was not a happenstance or a mistake. Note that in the second paragraph, Lincoln's use of the word all has now expanded. It now includes both parties to the war. Both Unionists and rebels dreaded and sought to avert war. Now, there are some scholars who are struck by the kind of moral even-handedness of Lincoln's presentation, and I think there's something to that observation, but I think it's often exaggerated. And Lincoln's reliance on indefinite pronouns, so the main indefinite pronoun, as I've already said, is the word all, but there are others as well, both, each, and neither. Those are all indefinite pronouns. It generates an impression of impartiality and equivalence. However, there is an undeniable moral judgment expressed toward the parties. Right? The insurgents have set their face against the nation's survival. They are actively seeking to destroy it without war. The other side, the government, refuses to allow the nation to perish, and it is devoted altogether to saving the Union. Despite these sharp discriminations, Lincoln does not place sole blame for the war on the insurgents. It took both parties, acting as they did for the reasons they did, to produce the war that neither wanted. So paragraph 2 explains the outbreak of the war, but it does not address the cause of the war. The deeper matter of causation is the topic to which Lincoln turns in the third paragraph. Now, the third paragraph begins with a part of the whole not yet mentioned. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. Lincoln highlights various features of this portion of the population: the number, the color, the condition, and the location of these residents are all important. But perhaps most important is simply the description of these persons as belonging to the whole. Lincoln speaks of slaves, not slavery. He focuses on real human beings rather than an institution. Not being free citizens, these colored slaves have no say in their location. Thus, they are distributed rather than having chosen to live or reside somewhere. Note how careful Lincoln's phrasing is. He does not speak of the South, but of the southern part of the Union. Over the course of the war, it might have been easy to slip into regarding the North as synonymous with the Union. I tend to do this myself. I'm a Yankee born and bred, you know, so, but that's a mistake. And Lincoln rejects that identification. The Union is the whole, and the residents of this southern part, whether they be colored slaves or white citizens, are part of the whole. Lincoln's description also indicates that slavery and color are entwined with one another. Not all colored people were slaves. About 1/10 of the colored population were free, but all slaves were colored or regarded as colored. Significantly, however, Lincoln does not use the word race. In fact, if you examine his speeches from the 1850s, it shows that he generally avoided the term race. By contrast, the defenders of slavery routinely identified slaves as belonging to the African race. Race language suggests the existence of essentially different categories, and especially in the mouth of a white supremacist, carried an implication of race-based hierarchy. Lincoln's preferred language, color, it does take note of a visible difference, but one that is only skin deep and is moreover arrayed across a spectrum. Nonetheless, the fact that condition and color are linked, in other words, enslavement and color, makes this demographic stand out as a distinct and identifiable minority within the whole. So slaves comprise an anomalous part. The next sentence provides further definition. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. Now, the word peculiar had long been peculiarly associated with slavery. In a coinage traceable to John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, slavery was euphemistically called the South's peculiar institution. Lincoln has so far in the speech avoided the word slavery or the word institution. Instead, he speaks of these slaves as a peculiar interest. I think the formulation captures the essence of enslavement. Human beings become a commodity in which other human beings hold an economic interest. Without naming the commodifiers, the oligarchic few who were slave owners and slave dealers, he is penetrating to the motive behind the peculiar institution. After more accurately describing slave ownership as an interest rather than an institution, and I think thereby reminding us actually of James Madison's observation in Federalist 10 that interests are powerful drivers of political faction, Lincoln then declares all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. So the statement is unequivocal, all knew, which is to say both those who shared the interest and those who did not were aware that this interest was the cause of the war. Although the cause was known to all, the operation of the cause is unspecific. This interest was somehow the cause of the war. Now, the next sentence gives a little bit more detail about the somehow, because it moves from the all, which is the point of agreement, all knew, to a specification of the divergent aims of the parties, and especially the scope of those aims. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of this interest. Now, Lincoln now clearly denominates the parties as the insurgents and the government. What was at issue then was whether this interest, in other words, the economic system based on property and man, whether that interest would spread, thereby becoming perpetual, or whether it would be confined to its existing localization in the southern part of the Union, right? Remember, the Republican policy was, we're not going to let slavery spread into the new territories, but we can't, Constitution doesn't give us any power to do anything about it in the slave states where slavery already exists. Although divided over this interest, the parties were in many ways the same. For instance, they had the same mistaken expectation that the war would be quick and easy. Even though they knew that slavery was the cause of the war, they did not anticipate that the war would bring about the end of slavery. Maybe just a note here about the structure of the speech. The most obvious dividing line is the third paragraph's shortest sentence. The Almighty has his own purposes. This sentence serves as a kind of fulcrum. It's the point at which the causal analysis shifts from a purely human, rationally calculative perspective to a viewpoint subspecie aeternitas, under the aspect of eternity. Right? The Almighty has his own purposes. However, it might be just as defensible to split the paragraph 3 sentences earlier, for that is the moment at which religion is first introduced into the speech. So Lincoln points out that both read the same Bible, right? Both sides, both parties to the war, read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. So religion appears on the political scene because of the human behavior that seeks to muster God militarily, right? To declare that God is on your side. Now, another indication of the significance of this moment in the speech is that the verb tense dramatically shifts from the past tense to the present tense. So look at the previous clauses, right? Neither party expected, neither anticipated that, each looked for, right? All past tense. So you might expect him to continue both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. But instead he says both read, right? He leaps from the past tense to the present tense, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. Now when you actually look at the speech in print, you're not actually aware of the shift in tense until you get to the verb pray, because the past and present tense of read are heteronyms. They're spelled the same, but they're pronounced differently. It's kind of a brilliant moment. In other words, it puts the focus on the word pray when you really realize you're in the present tense. When the two parties found that their expectations and calculations were foiled, they both turned to divine assistance. They turned to the identical Bible, the identical God, and even the identical prayer. This religious commonality, the bond of shared Christian belief, was weaponized equally by both parties to the war. In other words, they deployed religion divisively, attempting to claim God for their side. From this point forward, which is approximately the halfway point of the speech, religion will be the main topic. This same God will be invoked a total of 14 times over the next 9 sentences. Starting from the conflictual way in which religious appeals have figured in the war, Lincoln will try to reverse that. And he does so not by insisting on a strict separation of religion and politics, but rather by doing religion differently. Try to show you what I mean by that. Now, what happens in the next sentence? Perhaps imitating the religious crusaders, Lincoln's own impartiality seems to break down in the next sentence, and he bursts out. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. After so strongly expressing his conviction that slavery is at odds with God's justice, Lincoln then pulls back from his assignment of moral blame by paraphrasing another Bible verse. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. He puts these two opposing thoughts, both drawn from the Bible, into one sentence, and he juxtaposes them. This is my favorite use of a semicolon in all of literature. It's a brilliant use of a semicolon, right? These are in the same sentence. How dare anyone ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces? Semicolon. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. So God is anti-slavery. But God also warns against judging others. Human beings should beware of hypocrisy. All are sinners and guilty. Lincoln seems to be administering a check to self-righteousness, and especially the self-righteousness of those on the anti-slavery side. This is his first use of the words us and we, and they entail a correction of his own side in the struggle. The temptation to denounce the other side is strong, and a love of justice encourages righteous anger. Lincoln briefly gives vent to such feelings himself. Right? How dare they do that? But then he reins himself in with a reminder that he too is under judgment. So what does he do next? He returns to the fact that both sides pray. And he isn't any longer going to disparage the content of another man's prayer. Nonetheless, since prayers are addressed to a higher power, perhaps we can conclude something about God's judgment from God's answers to prayer. Lincoln presents a logical analysis. Since the prayers of the two parties are diametrically opposed, the prayers of both could not be answered. In other words, God himself is bound by the principle of non-contradiction. Then Lincoln says, that of neither has been answered fully. Now this is curious, since one of the logical possibilities is that God favored one side's prayers over the other. And we know God has done stuff like that. What was the original fratricidal conflict? Cain and Abel? Abel's offering to God saw favor, and Cain's did not. That's why Cain killed his brother. So isn't the progress of Union arms, which Lincoln mentioned in the opening paragraph as reasonably satisfactory, isn't that a sign that God is on the Union side? And certainly this is how the pulpits of the North were presenting the outcome of the war. Right? God's truth was marching on. Battle hymn of the Republic. But Lincoln leaves out that possibility. In other words, he doesn't make the usual triumphalist move. Instead, he administers another check to moral superiority, saying modestly, well, the prayer of neither side has been answered fully. Now, that's certainly true of the insurgents, right? They can't be too impressed with the efficacy of prayer at this late date in the war. Lincoln's phrasing covers over the significant gap between the outcomes for the two parties. The Union may not have gotten all it wanted, but it is on the cusp of winning. But Lincoln's formulation actually draws attention away from that fact. And instead, what he emphasizes is the commonality of disappointed prayers, years worth of them, as the war dragged on, and hundreds of thousands of young men died. And that leads to the most powerful pivot moment in the speech. The Almighty has his own purposes. God is not our tool or our instrument. Lincoln suggests that God's purposes were for a long time mysterious. But he also suggests that the terrible and the protracted course of the war and its fundamental and astounding result, freedom for 4 million persons, that must be part of God's purposes. God's purposes have disclosed themselves over time and through our mutual suffering, the woe that we have undergone. Lincoln quotes yet another Bible verse, Matthew 18:7, about sin, its inevitability, and God's punishment of it. He has arrived now at the point toward which the argument has been aiming. In the longest sentence of the speech, Lincoln presents his theological interpretation of the meaning of the Civil War, and he interprets it as the blood price that the nation must pay for the sin of slavery. Note that he presents his interpretation not as certain knowledge. It is a supposition, if we shall suppose. Right? The interpretation is a hypothesis offered as such. And the diffidence with which he offers it, the complexity of the sentence itself, it's an incredibly complex sentence. I think all of that takes away or drains away any religious fanaticism. Right? Because Lincoln is actually very worried about what happens when religious fanaticism seeps into politics. Now, it's true that Lincoln is using religion for political purposes, but he's using religion to encourage humility rather than pridefulness. Another thing to note is that he now finally uses the word slavery. And slavery is not Southern slavery, it's not African slavery, it is American slavery. And both words are capitalized. The offense of slavery belongs to the nation as a whole, and thus the punishment of the war applies to both North and South. All white Americans have been complicit in slavery. Even those who oppose slavery could be said to have benefited from it. All Americans wore cotton, and they all consumed sugar. Many Northerners made fortunes, or they inherited fortunes from the trade in those goods or the trade in the slaves themselves. In a way, I think Lincoln is describing what is now called white privilege, the unmerited status and advantages that accrue based on the possession of white skin and built on the oppression of those of another skin color. Lincoln frames his suggestion that the nation is being punished for the sin of slavery as a hypothesis, and then he follows that up still in the same sentence with a question. If this supposition of God punishing the nation for American slavery is true, then would we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Now, I think the implied answer is no. In other words, a God who acts in this way would in fact be a just God. And justice is the main attribute that Lincoln has mentioned as belonging to God. Yet, we might raise some questions about this implied answer. Is it just for hundreds of thousands of non-slaveholders to die in the conflict? All of the Union dead were non-slaveholders. Many of them were determined foes of slavery. A significant number of them were former slaves who, after the Emancipation Proclamation, fought on the Union side. Even most of the Southern deaths were of non-slaveholders, since slaveholders, especially large slaveholders, were a tiny minority of Southerners. There's a case to be made that those poor white Southerners were the victims of the oligarchic slavocracy of the South, just as the slaves themselves were. We might also raise the question of generational fairness. In what sense was the war the just deserts, the woe due, to that particular generation of Americans? Why should all those previous generations, some of those who began the offense, why should they get off scot-free? Is collective guilt a just concept? Now, it seems to me that Lincoln doesn't actually assert it to be just. Remember, he floats that interpretation of the war as a hypothesis and a question. He does hope, I think, that many Christians will be inclined to accept this interpretation as true. And then at this point, so we've had this long, difficult sentence. Lincoln now interrupts his account of God's possible purposes to express our human reaction to this punishment. We hope and pray for it to cease. Fondly do we hope that this mighty scourge of war might speedily pass away. We hope and pray for it to cease. The sentence rhymes. It partly serves as a breather between the two sentences that flank it, both of which are very complex as sentences and very painful in content. Remember, when Lincoln mentioned prayer earlier in the speech, the two sides were praying for military victory against the other side. But now, look what has happened to the nation's prayers. Now he has them jointly praying for the war to end. God let it end. But just as the earlier prayers were not fully answered, this one might not be either. In other words, God's will is what will prevail. And Lincoln formulates another final hypothetical about God's will. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This is the most remarkable sentence of all. Lincoln takes us back, all the way back, to the origin date of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. If you do the math, and there is actually always math in a Lincoln speech. 7 years ago, you got to do the math there. If you do the math here, subtract 250 from 1865, you get 1615. Lincoln is giving the approximate date, the beginning of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, in the Northern Hemisphere. But it's not far off the actual date of 1619. And in fact, Lincoln knew the exact date from his reading of, I think the historian's name is Griswold. Now, the Gettysburg Address had traced the birth of the United States to 1776, 7 years ago. But the second inaugural singles out 1619 as the date of America's original sin. In effect, the nation has been engaged in a war that pits the spirit of 1776 against the spirit of 1619. Not only that, but Lincoln says that if God wanted to exact full justice, dollar for dollar and blood for blood, the war might continue much longer. Divine reparations would exact much more than any of our current notions about reparations. If God were to be a just God, rather than a merciful God, Lincoln says, quoting Psalms 19:9, then we would still be forced to say that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now, the most important question, what does this theological interpretation achieve? I believe that what it does is make possible the final paragraph of the speech. If Americans will join Lincoln in understanding the war in this way, then space will be cleared for human charity, or at least a lessening of human malice. The theological interpretation has a political purpose, to gentle the mindset of his fellow citizens and prepare them for the difficult work of reconstruction ahead. So, a little more specifically, how does Lincoln's invocation of 1619 help to unite the discordant parts of the nation? By emphasizing shared national suffering as a consequence of shared national transgression, Lincoln seeks to check the moral preening of the Northerners and lessen their prosecutorial zeal. Remember, radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens, they blamed the South for the war, and they wanted them to pay. Stevens thought that the Southern states should be stripped of statehood, reduced to territorial status, and as he said, made to eat the fruit of foul rebellion for a generation or more. At the same time, so in other words, he really is trying to restrain that Northern desire to kind of extract their own version of reparations. At the same time, by nationalizing the blame for slavery, or by desectionalizing the blame, right? It's American slavery. Lincoln, I think, is trying to do what he can to help Southerners join in admitting the error of their ways. This is more than a display of magnanimity towards the defeated. Lincoln simply does not assume the stance of a generous victor. He's refusing to call the result a victory for the Union. The emphasis is on shared national transgression. If accepted, Lincoln's hypothesis about the meaning of the war would link whites north and south in humility. I think he's aware of the danger of, kind of lost cause recalcitrance by white Southerners. He can't do a lot about that, but he's doing what he can in this speech to try to make that not the outcome. Then finally, what consolation and promise does this interpretation hold for blacks? While whites are emphatically told that God was all along on the side of the bondsman, blacks are encouraged to believe that the long delay, 250 years, the long delay in vindicating them was also somehow part of divine providence. Further, the President of the United States has declared that God would now be justified were he to exact eye for eye vengeance on their behalf. This national confession of guilt does not do away with the need for political justice going forward, but the thought that Americans have been punished, really punished. One soldier died for every 7 persons enslaved from 1619 until 1865. That might incline these new black citizens toward a stance of thanksgiving for their blood-bought freedom and patience for the struggles ahead. One hint that Lincoln's message to the black population was understood can be seen in the fact that in every post-war speech in which Frederick Douglass mentioned Lincoln, he quoted this passage, the divine reparations passage from the Second Inaugural. One final point. If full justice was not demanded by God, in other words, if God in the end was merciful to the nation, he stopped short of the full blood sacrifice, then maybe all Americans might be willing to imitate that generosity in their treatment of one another. Lincoln's spiritualized understanding of the war was designed to help the various parts of the American whole to rise above their worst passions: arrogance, vindictiveness, resentment, hatred, rage, clearing the way for genuine atonement with the hope that all could be encompassed within newly forged bonds of civic affection. Note the stress in the speech's final sentence. The final paragraph is one sentence. Note the stress on the word all. 3 times it's used here, attaining its maximal extension each time. A quick overview of the 10 occurrences of all through the speech shows the development. Remember, Lincoln started with all Unionists in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, the reference encompassed the all composed of both parties to the war. By the end of the third paragraph, the term had been expanded to include the formerly enslaved population and all their stolen labor. Finally, in the universalizing fourth paragraph, Lincoln calls on his listeners to feel charity for all, to strive to do all that accords with peace properly understood, closing with a global extension to all nations. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln deprived the American people of the statesman best equipped to follow his own advice. How much difference it would have made is impossible to know, yet for us today, the most important thing is that the words and example of Lincoln remain. He still communicates his thoughts to us, and we in turn can converse with him. His spirit abides. If we listen and reflect, all may yet be well for the divided America of our day.
I can make the question longer if you need a little more of a breather. So as you alluded to at the end of your remarks, we are in an incredibly divided time in the present moment. And so I was curious, the great unifier that Lincoln uses in the speech is religious rhetoric and evocations to God. And so I'm curious, what kind of great unifier do you think that we could have at this moment?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In other words, the resources of rhetoric, of political rhetoric, have been impoverished, I would say. So I think one can still read and respond to this speech, but, nobody could give this speech because, we haven't had another Lincoln, but there are good speeches that aren't Lincoln speeches, and I think the resources of rhetoric today are very impoverished, and the loss of a kind of shared religious faith is part of that. So it's harder to know what you can appeal to, what common ground you can find. Now, note though, he also thought that religion can make things worse, right? I mean, he shows how religion initially was used very divisively. So he thought you needed to do religion better for it to serve as the common bond that might be possible. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that other than say that I don't know what you construct a great speech out of today.
So Lincoln often used, as you said, religious rhetoric or explicitly Christian
Wait,
religious.
where's the questioner? Ah, great, okay.
Explicitly Christian religious rhetoric, but in many other speeches he also uses civil religion, references to the founders and the Constitution and Americans' shared history as a nation. Why do you think he chose to rely more or less exclusively on religious rhetoric and not on any of his sort of civil religion in this particular speech?
Yeah, good. Actually, it is interesting if you look at early Lincoln speeches, like the Lyceum Address, when he's quite young, he's 28 years old, the Temperance Address. Almost all of those addresses end with a kind of invocation. They also use religious language and incorporate some kind of Christian echoes and resonances. But all of those early speeches end with a kind of invocation of George Washington. He has these lovely kind of prayers and invocations of the great Washington. And that remains true even in speeches in the 1850s, that he will kind of end with some kind of appeal to George Washington. In this little farewell address that he delivers in Springfield as he's ready to board the train to come to Washington to assume the presidency, he says, I leave, not knowing whether I will ever return, with a task upon me greater than that Washington faced. So he recognizes that at that moment, right, saving the Union will be a more difficult task than founding the Union. And he ends that little farewell address with an invocation of God. And then from that moment forward, it's true of the first inaugural as well. He ends with an appeal to God in the first inaugural. So it's as if, he needs bigger guns than George Washington in order to get through the Civil War.
Other questions?
Thanks, Dr. Schaub.
Yeah, I mean, just maybe one. I'm sorry. One further note about that. I mean, it is true. He will continue as president to appeal to the Declaration. I mean, he does it most famously in the Gettysburg Address. Right? That does take us back to the Declaration. So he hasn't completely gone away from that. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I find it interesting that Lincoln uses brevity of speech for events that have already transpired. But during, for example, his first inaugural address, which was some 5 times as long as his second, he even seeks to appease Southern states' rights and offers an acceptance of slavery as it currently exists. So my question, as a retired surgeon who has treated a multitude of individuals with war-related facial blast injuries, is when you look at the events going on globally today, as an example, NATO and Russia, the United States and China, Israel and Hamas, are we going to have a potential to preclude further warring occurrences, or are we just basically wasting our time?
So initially I thought you were going to ask me a question that I'd like to answer about why does he write such brief speeches while he's president, and then you took a different turn there. Okay. I mean, I think war is a permanent feature of the human condition. So I don't think we are going to preclude war. And you can look at a speech like the first inaugural, where I think Lincoln is doing everything he can in the moment to get the secessionists to be less hasty and to think a little bit about what they're doing. He says, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, think calmly and well. So he is trying to create some space for them to reconsider what they're doing. I think he also knows that that is probably going to be unsuccessful. He gives it his best chance. He explains why secession is unconstitutional. He explains why he has to remain true to his oath of office and that he will remain true to his oath of office and defend the integrity of the nation and keep the Union together. Think about that final paragraph of the first inaugural. He actually wanted to close it the paragraph before, which is about the oath. So the first inaugural begins with the oath that he swore in heaven to preserve the Union. He wanted to end it with the oath. It was William Seward who suggested that he have a kind of nice, final paragraph, kind of reach out to them a little bit, we're not enemies but friends. And so Lincoln says, yeah, okay, yeah, fine, you draft it for me. Lincoln almost always wrote every single word of his speech, but he said, all right, yeah, Seward, go ahead, show me what you have in mind. It's really fascinating to compare those two paragraphs. Seward does a kind of workmanlike job, but the opening that Seward had for that last paragraph is, I close. We are not enemies but friends. And Lincoln changes it to, I am loath to close. You feel the difference there, right? I close is exactly how, undergraduate papers, like, in conclusion, right? I am loath to close. I don't want to stop talking because this is my last chance to try to reason with you, right? To remind you that you are simply my dissatisfied fellow countrymen. I'm only here for a brief term of 4 years. You really can wait me out. You'll have another shot at this. My dissatisfied fellow countrymen. Lincoln produces these unbelievable speeches, but in a sense, each one of them is actually a failure. Right? He gave the Lyceum Address in 1838. He pleaded with Americans to avoid mob rule, to avoid vigilante justice, to stop thinking that there was some other way to achieve justice other than through law. That didn't work. And the war came. In the first inaugural, he tried to talk to his dissatisfied fellow countrymen. That didn't work. Shots are fired within a few weeks. In the Gettysburg Address, tries to set the nation on the path of the new birth of freedom. Even more so in the second inaugural, charity for all. What did the next 100 years look like? None of these speeches achieve what he hoped they would achieve, but they are still invaluable to us today for those of us who will listen.
I think we have a question here.
Well, mine's not really a question, but just how fabulous your lecture was tonight. And for those of us that maybe had not reread this speech, how much is in here, how much pertinent, how much he says for reconciliation. But I wanted to make a note, one thing I loved, because with today's rhetoric, with white Christian nationality, I love the fact that he uses God, not Christ, not Jesus.
Right. Yes.
God. It's more unifying.
Right.
Or at least it would be today.
Yes, and this is actually true, not only of Lincoln, but this really was the standard that was set by, George Washington and others. Regular invocations of God, but not specifically Christian. So, in fact, this is language that can unite all monotheists, at least, right? People of the book, Christians, Jews, Muslims. Yeah, but I think even though it's fairly kind of generic in its monotheism, I think that even that today is controversial or could be controversial. Yeah.
We have time for at least one more question.
There are a couple of exceptions, by the way. John Adams, in his Thanksgiving proclamation, I believe he does speak of Christ, but that's unusual. That's very unusual. Yeah.
One more over here, and if you have some more time, we'll have time and afterward during the reception if you have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your speech. It was very insightful. You answered this a little bit, but I wanted to ask about like the public reception to the speech, and if either side of the war responded differently, or what the impact of the different sides were. Thank you also.
Yeah, good. It was not popular. Okay, and Lincoln knew that. Actually, I'm prepared for this question. So let me just read you something else from Lincoln. So this fellow Thurlow Weed wrote Lincoln after the inaugural address, and kind of praised him or something. And Lincoln writes this short letter back. Everyone likes a compliment. Thank you for yours on the little notification speech and on the recent inaugural address. Inaugural spelled wrong. I expect the latter. The second inaugural, I expect the latter to wear as well as perhaps better than anything I have produced. In other words, he believed it was his greatest speech and that it would be recognized as his greatest speech in the long run. I expect the latter to wear as well as perhaps better than anything I have produced. But I believe it is not immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there's been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. It is a truth which I thought needed to be told, and as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it. Now that's really interesting, to think of the speech as somehow involving the humiliation of Lincoln. Now, I think part of what he means is that he has humbled himself by not taking credit for winning the war, right? I mean, he could have done that. That's what most other presidents would have done on that occasion. You're on the cusp of victory, you claim credit for it. So in that sense, he has humbled himself, or he has humiliated himself. But I think, actually, that there's something deeper in it. And I think what he means is that he understood the war to be about the Union. And his oath of office said he had to preserve the Union. And whatever he was going to do about slavery was because it contributed to saving the Union. So he does issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he believes that that is now the only way to save the Union. Right? But for him, the abolition of slavery is and always was secondary to the preservation of the Union. Okay? I mean, he hated slavery. There's no doubt about that. He hated slavery his entire life. But he had been elected president of the United States. His task was to save the Union. But in the second inaugural, he is in a way admitting that there was something else going on. There was some deeper thing going on. And what he has glimpsed, or what he now supposes, is that God had his own purpose in that war. And God's purpose was different from Lincoln's purpose. I think that's really what he means by the humiliation of himself.
Well, to quote Lincoln, I'm a little loath to close myself. But we are past the hour. If you would, we'd love to have you join us in the Mulcher Commons for reception. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, Dr. Schaub will be there. And let's just give her another round of applause. That was truly an extraordinary speech. Thank you all for being here. Hello.